In this lesson, we're going to be matching the carcass animation to the body movements. Okay, so let's go ahead and get started by looking through our camera. So I'll go ahead and click that. And we also need to make sure that the size of our project has been set up because this looks a little bit square and we want to be working at 1280 by 720 because that's the size of the footage we're using. So if we go into our render settings, sure enough, those are set to 1280 by 720, but it's always a good idea just to check. Okay, so to go ahead and get started, let's kind of pull this out a little bit so it's a little more, it's filling this a little bit better. And while we're looking through this camera, I'm just going to collapse or close those zombie guts and we'll just select the whole piece here. And then what I want to do is start to position it so that it's on top of our zombie. Okay, so maybe rotate that back a little bit. And definitely something that will be a, maybe something that you're tempted to do is to push this down like this so that it's more on top of him. But what you should do instead is scale it down to make it look a little bit more like that. So I'll scale this down a bit. And you can see already that makes it look like it's a little bit farther down. We don't want to move this at all in the y-axis because we aligned our camera or calibrated our camera with this grid, and we don't ever want our carcass to dip below that 0 point. If I come out of that camera view here and I middle click and let's take a look at it from the front view, you can see that this is right on that ground plane, and that is exactly what we want. We don't ever want the zombie carcass to dip down below, even if it makes it look like it will match up with the zombie better. We want to keep it right there on that ground plane because that's going to make adjusting our shadows easier. And then if we need to move it down, we can do it in Nuke later whenever we start compositing. Okay, so I'm pretty certain that that looks pretty good there. You can play around with it a little bit more. It's important to get the starting position as close to the movement of the actual zombie as you can. And I might even pull this backwards a little bit more if I want it to show up more outside of his body. So what's going to happen if I turn this off for a second is when we get into Nuke later, we're going to cut off these legs and just have kind of a rotoscope around the shirt part. So part of this carcass will be sticking out from behind the shirt, but the other part that's in here is going to sometimes be farther inside of the shirt and sometimes be farther out depending on how the zombie shirt moves, you see, as he crawls. So with that in mind, that's kind of what we're shooting for here with this animation. So you can decide how far you want this to come out of the shirt, but just keep in mind and know that that is kind of what it's going to be looking like. So I just kind of play around with it till I get it to the point. Make sure that it's at the right place in the in the y-axis, and then you need to go into your zombie guts, select that, go into your coordinates, and freeze your transformations. So you'll just drop this down and hit freeze all. So that's going to make a big difference for you. You want to make sure you're on the first frame or frame 0. That is going to make a huge difference in the way that this turns out. If your transformations are frozen, you're just going to have a way better time. Okay, so to get started, let's go ahead and set our first keyframe. So we'll go ahead and click Record Active Objects. And we also need to check on some of these here. So what this is going to be is our position. We do want to have that ability to change that over time. We don't want to change our scale over time. We did it to get it into place at the beginning, but we don't want to change that now. We are going to be animating the rotation, so we'll turn that on as well. And this is for a specific parameter, so we don't have any of those set up for this, so we'll just leave it for animating the position and rotation, and we don't need to animate at the point level, so don't worry about checking that on at this point. We will later, but not now. Okay, so to get started, we have a keyframe set here by clicking record active objects, and you can see a keyframe is set. And then something I like to do is go ahead and turn on my auto key. You don't have to, but it just makes it a little bit faster so that you can make the choices and the movements and then move on. So we'll go ahead and scrub forward a little bit. Let's come forward to about, let's say right there. And it looks like he rotates a little bit like this and then starts to move forward. So we can scrub backwards slightly and you see how that moves along with him. Now we want a big push in the forward movement when his knee pushes off. So if I scrub forward to about, let's see right here, I'm going to move this back just slightly so that the forward movement doesn't start quite so soon. And then we can come forward, let's say to about right here, and really bring this forward more. Maybe rotate it around a little bit more as well. Perfect. So you can see how that starts to really match up with his movement as he comes forward. Now later we're going to start noticing that he's got a little bit of wobble in his hips, and we can come back in and add that later on, but we just want to kind of get the rough animation started here first. So you see there's a lot of wobble right there, and then he's getting ready to move forward again right about here. So let's just move this forward a little bit. Say by now he's maybe just kind of edged forward, and then from here to here, he moves forward a pretty good amount. So we'll just pull that forward on that x-axis, just like that. And then it looks like he has just a little bit more forward movement right there. So we'll just pull that with him just a little bit more. And then let's find the next place where looks like he kind of continues. So there he moves forward some. And also at this point, he's rotated a little bit. So we'll rotate that around. Forward, forward. A little bit more rotation, but we can fix that in a moment. Here he's moved forward a little bit more. And also at this point, this is starting to kind of come a little bit more towards us. So we can pull that over on that z-axis. So you see how he kind of rolls his body over. So that's perfect that happens at that point. And then he really just kind of rears back, doesn't move forward a lot more. So actually we could even push this back a bit and maybe even rotate it back a little bit more this way. And that's just going to help have that match up with him a little bit better. Okay, so now that we've gotten those rough keyframes in there, let's go ahead and hit play and just watch this and see how it moves. So it's still pretty rough. He's got a lot more subtle movement in there than we've added at this point, but we're off to a good start. So let's go ahead and with this selected, let's kind of start to add a few more little subtle movements. And actually we have a pretty big shift from here to here. So I think at this point we should probably on this keyframe scoot this over a little bit closer onto his body. And then just kind of go back through making sure that we're on top of those keyframes and have that sideways movement happen a little bit more gradually because it seemed very sudden. Okay, that's pretty good. Just scrubbing here. So you see we don't get that huge sideways movement on that z-axis anymore. Okay, so now what I'm going to do is we'll open up our zombie guts and I'm going to turn off a few of these so that we can really see the motion back here on our zombie's hips. So we'll turn off our dark organ, we'll turn off our light organ, we can turn off the skin, pretty much only leaving the skeleton at this point. Because that is going to be a lot easier to see through and see those movements. Okay, so we'll just kind of come back here and now you see when I scrub, we can really start to see some of that sideways movement. Now it's really important, it's a temptation to start to want to rotate it like this whenever he moves that way, but you have to remember that those guts come off the back of it and are going to cause some issues for you. So you want to undo that. Make sure you don't do any motion up and down. We're only going to be doing rotation on either the y-axis or very, very subtle movement on the z, excuse me, on the x. I really wouldn't recommend hardly any on the x. If you want to, it's probably just going to cause you some issues. So it looks like here we get a little bit of a rotation in his hips this way, so we can go ahead and add that, so that'll move with him. And then here we've got that pretty well under control with what we already roughed in. Now at this point, he really starts to rotate some more, so we can add that in. And then he kind of hits and begins to rotate back the other way. So on this other keyframe we had set earlier, let's pull this back a bit. And honestly, I think this might be a little too far forward, so let's pull this back a little bit there to overwrite that keyframe. Then he kind of rotates back around to the right, so we'll rotate our skeleton that way. And then he really gets a big rotation this way. And honestly, he does rotate his back a little bit this way, but I really don't want to risk having those guts not looking like they're lying flat on the ground. So later we'll add a little bit of secondary animation to the tailbone, and that will really help to make that look a little more realistic. But we can rotate this maybe a little bit more this way, and that can help in that. There we go. Okay, so let's see, it goes down this way, and then right about there it starts to go back the other way, so we need to rotate it back around this way. We're just matching those movements with what he's already doing. And here we get very subtle animation of that rotation property back around the other direction. It's actually a little bit closer. We can grab that keyframe and just pull it back. See there? We've pretty much got that rotation under control. You could maybe add a little bit if you wanted it to rotate more this way, kind of with him. This looks like that slides forward a little bit too far, so we can pull that back a little bit. And let's rotate this back around that way. Now that looks like a little bit too much too fast, so we'll pull this back in the other direction, a little bit closer to where it was before. And we're getting really close. Let's go ahead and just watch this through. I'll go ahead and hit the play button. So you can kind of see how those subtle rotations really help to make this match a lot more closely to the movements of his body. So in between lessons, I'm going to come in here and finish up this animation, just adding some really subtle little rotations to match his hip movement. So you can see right in between here, we've got one where we can just animate on that Y rotation. So definitely pay attention to those. It's going to help to make this look a lot more realistic, and don't fall into the temptation of wanting to animate the rotation on these other two axes, because that is going to make a big difference in the way that those guts lie on the ground. It's not really going to look very realistic. So stick around, and in the next lesson we'll begin using an FFD to start to make the guts look like there's a little more friction with the ground, like they're really sticking there.